So I was in Indonesia last year working as a correspondent for the Sydney Morning Herald and The Age, and we were covering the new Jakarta Governor Anies Baswedan's inaugural speech. And it was sent to us via WhatsApp, as things often are when you're working as a journalist in Indonesia. And we were listening to it, and I could see my colleague's eyes widen when she heard something. And what Anies had just said was, in the past, we pribumi were oppressed and defeated. Now we have independence. Now is the time to be host in our own home. And she had that same, did I hear that right, expression on her face that people had when Peter Dutton used the word grooming to refer to the former Australian Border Commissioner, and also, of course, when Fraser Anning used the word final solution. She had that kind of stunned, and she replayed the audio about 3 times to make sure that that was the expression that he in fact used. And I said, what? You know, isn't he just referring to, Indonesia gaining independence from its colonial Dutch oppressors? And she said, well, I mean, you have to understand, Jewel, that the word pribumi tends to exclude Chinese Indonesians. And I said, are you saying that Anies was dog whistling? And she said, what's dog whistling? And I had the most excruciating kind of explanation. I said, well, it's sort of like dogs hear things at a different pitch to humans. And I did the worst job of trying to explain what I was meaning. Anyway, someone who really did a beautiful job of explaining to me what was significant about this speech was, in fact, of course, Charlotte, who very serendipitously is, Charlotte Setijadi is the person who is speaking about it today. And she was always my go-to when I needed things explained to. Charlotte is the Assistant Professor of Humanities at the School of Social Sciences at Singapore Management University. She obtained her PhD in anthropology from La Trobe University with a thesis that critically examines Chinese identity politics in Post-Suharto, Indonesia. So she could not be better placed to speak on this.
Hello, good morning, everybody. Thanks for being here on such a sunny, lovely day when the Floriade's on. So I double appreciate you being here. Thank you very much, first of all, to Greg Feely and Ronit Ritchie for inviting me here. It's such an honor to speak at the Indonesian Update. And hopefully I can shed a bit more light about what's been going on, particularly in terms of anti-Chinese sentiments, particularly after the Ahok saga that happened in Jakarta last year that we all know about. Speaking about the ethnic Chinese, I guess I was just talking with my 2 other panelists that it's relatively easy because everybody already knows so much about the ethnic Chinese. When we're talking about ethnic minorities in Indonesia, the Chinese Indonesians arguably are the most analyzed or most talked about. I guess in many ways because historically, politically, economically, their position is one of the most complex in Indonesian society. Yesterday, Robert Cribb spoke about ambiguous advantages received by different minority groups in Indonesia. Every time I speak to some of my non-Chinese respondents, a few of them sometimes argue that actually, maybe the ethnic Chinese shouldn't be regarded as a minority at all because, they are an economic majority, right? And this is at least some of the assumptions that are quite popular, particularly among non-Chinese Indonesians. And, hopefully this is something that I can address as well today during my talk. But today I'll be talking about anti-Chinese sentiments and what I call the return of the pre-Bumi discourse, particularly in the post-Ahok months since the Jakarta election last year. My main argument is that despite 20 years of reforms in Indonesia, and this is the 20th year anniversary of the May 1998 riots that was so pivotal for Chinese Indonesians, and also the beginning of the reforms that enabled the resurgence of Chinese identity politics in the Post-Suharto era. But after what we've seen in the last year, to me, that says that despite 20 years of legal and policy reforms that has happened in the Post-Suharto era, maybe not many things have actually changed that much at all in terms of the latent stereotypes and popular perceptions of Chinese Indonesians. We heard today from Marcus Mietzner's and Burhanuddin Muhtadi's presentation about the data comparing 2017 and 2018 sentiments about Chinese Indonesians, particularly by Muslims. Anti-Chinese sentiments are very easily stoked. Yes, in many ways, Ahok was an exceptional case because he's quite the singular politician, as we know. And for many anti-Ahok protesters, blasphemy was the main factor, and of course, it is correct. But anti-Chinese and also anti-China sentiments were so easily roused during the whole Ahok saga. And as I will show, this was not the first time in the Post-Suharto era that this has happened. So today I'll be talking about an analysis of anti-Chinese sentiment in the aftermath of the Ahok case in Jakarta. I will ask the question of whether this signals a return of pre-Bumi rhetoric in the public discourse, especially as what Ju just wonderfully mentioned before. We have been seeing a lot more of the politically charged term pribumi, particularly by politicians like Anies Baswedan, that heated up the political atmosphere even more. I will be looking a little bit, not so much, I won't go on too much about it, the data that we collected that Marcus and Burhan also mentioned before about non-Chinese perceptions of Chinese Indonesians that we collected during a survey that we conducted last year at ICS Yusof Ishak Institute that we asked to non-Chinese participants about the Chinese. So I'll be doing some interpretation of that. And lastly, I'll be discussing a bit more broadly about what all this means for Chinese Indonesians and what the future may hold. Are we regressing towards a new order era attitudes towards Chinese Indonesians? Particularly, because I don't have a lot of time, I'll be focusing on their involvements in the political sphere. But I won't go too much into this, but in the post-Suharto years, I'm sure a lot of you here can remember all the dramatic events that happened after the May 1998 riots that also targeted Chinese Indonesians, Chinese Indonesian businesses, residences. Chinese Indonesians were attacked, and that prompted a demand from the Chinese Indonesian community after the fall of Suharto to have some of the past wrongs righted, particularly in terms of some of the assimilationist policies that were in place during the New Order period. And I've listed some of them major post-Suharto reforms there, particularly about Chinese Indonesians. First of all was the abolition of New Order era assimilationist laws, so Chinese Indonesians could celebrate their Chineseness again in many ways. They can express themselves culturally, they can speak Chinese again in the public domain, Chinese publications were allowed to operate again, Chinese language can be taught at schools, even state schools. And most importantly was Chinese New Year declared as a national holiday, and Confucianism regarded as the sixth official state religion, which is quite problematic because in other countries Confucianism isn't really a religion in an organized sense of the word, but in Indonesia, it was regarded as the sixth religion, and this was regarded to be an important acknowledgement for the Chinese Indonesians. But an important gesture of reconciliation that the Habibie government did in 1998, and it's telling that this is one of the first things that they did in the post-1998 era, was the disuse of the word pre-Bumi in official documents. The issue of the term pre-Bumi is one that is particularly sensitive to Chinese Indonesians, as you might well know. The term has been politically charged. It's laden with historical baggage of decades of state-sanctioned discrimination against Chinese Indonesians. While by definition, pre-Bumi actually just means, somebody who's native to Indonesia, who's indigenous. But it is common knowledge that the term is used in derogatory reference to the ethnic Chinese mostly. So for instance, Indonesians of Indian or Arab descent or Yemeni descent, such as Anies Baswedan and FPI leader Rizik Syihab, are almost never referred to as a non-pre-Bumi or non-pre. So it is quite telling that after 1998, one of the first acts of gesture towards Chinese Indonesians was the disuse of the word in official documents. And in 2006, the Indonesian government also amended the citizenship law number 12/2006 that recognized all individuals born in Indonesia as asli or indigenous Indonesians, which means that Chinese Indonesians by law can run for president if they want because they're regarded as asli. So some areas of visible improvements include Chinese cultural expressions in public, particularly during Chinese New Year. Chinese public figures became much more visible, particularly artists and celebrities, and it was quite fashionable for a while to have sort of like a more oriental look in popular culture, particularly if you remember in 2004, there was this Taiwanese drama called Meteor Garden that was really popular during that time. So there were like some Cinetron spin-offs of Meteor Garden with Chinese Indonesian actors as the lead. So became more visible. But what I'll be talking about here is the greater political representation of Chinese Indonesians. Because immediately after 1998, the Chinese Indonesians that I spoke to said that 1998 proved that it was very harmful for Chinese Indonesians not to have political representation, because during times of political crisis, there was nobody there to speak up for them in the political sphere. So an interesting data that I want to show you here is the number of ethnic Chinese candidates in legislative elections over the years. So starting from 2004, we see here that at various levels, local, national levels in the legislative domain, in 2004 there were 100 ethnic Chinese candidates, and that number doubled, more than doubled in the 2009 election to 2013, to 213, sorry. And in 2014 we had 315 ethnic Chinese candidates, which is huge for ethnic Chinese participation. So in 2014, 15 ethnic Chinese members of parliament were elected to the DPR, so that represents roughly 2.8% of the total number of parliamentarians. So if you think about the unofficial number of percentage of ethnic Chinese in Indonesian population, it's roughly somewhere around 2.5 to 3%, so it's quite representative of the number of Chinese Indonesians in the archipelago. A lot of this, particularly for the younger generation who entered politics, who became candidates in 2014, and when I spoke to them, they told me that they were inspired by Ahok. A lot of them did anyway. Ahok at that time was Jakarta vice governor after his meteoric rise with Jokowi as his vice governor, considered to be a maverick politician symbolizing anti-corruption, good governance, progress, all that stuff. And Chinese Indonesian youngsters who were interested in politics at that time said that he was doing two things. One, representing Chinese Indonesians in the political sphere, and also breaking the stereotype that Chinese Indonesians are only interested in dagang, or only interested in trade or the economic domain. So Chinese Indonesians can also be nationalistic, can also be anti-corruption, can also be leaders in this regard. So it instilled a lot of confidence, a lot of optimism among Chinese Indonesians, particularly the young people. The rise of Ahok's political career, and also the generally positive changes for Chinese Indonesians in the Post-Suharto era prompted a lot of observers to think that maybe Indonesia no longer had a Chinese problem. I was just finishing my PhD at that time, and I thought, well, maybe my field's kind of obsolete now, because nobody's gonna be interested in this anymore. But of course, I couldn't be more wrong. After the Al-Maidah comments that I don't really need to tell you about. A lot of outrage against Ahok personally, against his allegations of blasphemy, of course, and people took to the streets, as you well know, with the 411 and the 212 movements. But what was really striking to me at that time was how quickly anti-Ahok narratives changed and also related to anti-Chinese and anti-China sentiments. So during that time, a lot of fake news, a lot of materials that circulated on social media, very much were quite derogatory towards anti-Chinese, towards the ethnic Chinese, not just to Ahok, but also materials such as this, that Ahok, with the project of reclaiming the Jakarta Cove, that was actually bankrolled by the 9 dragons. You probably heard that on social media, the 9 naga, or the ethnic Chinese tycoons, that actually were in cahoots with Ahok to build the new islands off the coast of Jakarta so they could host 10 million new mainland Chinese who want to settle and colonize in Indonesia. This is one of the fake news that were circulating at that time. It may sound really silly, like 10 million really, but that was certainly something that was circulating at that time. And this was quite striking to me because people, observers often question, whether anti-Chinese and anti-China sentiments in Indonesia are related to one another. But negative portrayals of China, and Jokowi is often accused of this, of being too dependent on Chinese money, particularly for infrastructure projects. When they're negatively portrayed in Indonesia, they are almost always associated with Chinese Indonesians as, the local cronies of the Chinese and the local collaborators of China's interest in dominating Indonesian politics and economy. You also see anti-China things such as this, that actually workers who come to Indonesia, workers that Jokowi has led into Indonesia, are actually tentara merah or communist armies. Oh, look at them! Don't they look like army personnel to you with their big bodies and haircuts? And this was circulating on social media a lot. So. We see this increase in anti-Chinese sentiments expressed on banners on streets, social media, and also by implicit comments made by anti-Ahok leaders, anti-Ahok protest leaders here. And you see here a lot of the use of the term pribumi as well in these banners too. So this prompted a lot of Chinese Indonesians and also observers to question whether we are seeing a rise again of expressions of anti-Chinese sentiments. So I've got there a few headlines from international publications that have similar things, such as from Time Magazine, from Reuters as well. But actually, even though, yes, it appears that anti-Chinese sentiments rose during the Ahok case and also in the immediate after of the Ahok case, if we look at the Post-Suharto years, this was not the first time that we've seen cases of anti-Chinese sentiments in public. One that didn't really get a lot of attention until recently was the Meliana case that happened in 2016, where Meliana in Tanjung Balai complained to her neighbor that the local mosque's Toa speaker was too loud, and of course she was sentenced to 1.5 years in jail under the same blasphemy law that got Ahok just a few weeks ago. But what wasn't that widely reported at that time was that comments in 2016 resulted in riots and the destruction of Buddhist temples in Tanjung Balai. Similar smaller scale incidents of neighborhood disagreements, like one that happened in Makassar a few years back, from a parked car that got bumped by an ethnic Chinese man, almost resulted in a neighborhood riot. So it's not a new thing to have a simple disagreement in the community suddenly turn big because of the Chinese ethnicity of one of the people involved in the dispute. Another worrying phenomenon that happened during this time, as Jewel mentioned before, is the increasing use of the term pribumi during and after the Ahok case. I've got there a comment made by Bakhtiar Nasir to Reuters, where he said that after Ahok, now that Ahok is in jail, the wealth of ethnic Chinese minority was a problem, and advocated an affirmative action program for native Indonesians, and he used the word pribumi, comments that stoked tensions already running high in Indonesia. Of course, Yusuf Kala, a repeat offender, using the word pribumi as well, made similar comments not long after that, saying that Chinese Indonesians should be, also caring about their pribumi counterparts. And most famously, Anies Baswedan used the term during his inaugural speech. Where he said, as Joe said, in the past, we pribumi were oppressed and defeated. Now we have independence. Now is the time to be host in our own home. And he was claiming that he was talking about the, pribumi Indonesians as a whole, and he was talking about the independence struggle against the Dutch and, the importance of independence. But just the use of the word pribumi itself didn't really do much to calm the situation down. Analysts such as Executive Director of Amnesty International, Usman Hamid, quickly criticized Baswedan's deliberate use of the word pribumi, pointing out that Baswedan's speech was racist and inflammatory and insensitive to the ethnic Chinese, given the situation at that time. Again, this was not the first time the term pribumi entered the fray again. In fact, even though it was disused from official documents in 1998, it was still part of everyday everyday speech. In August 2015, for instance, General Joko Santoso, with a group linked to the Gerindra party, formed Partai Pribumi, even though they remain small, but they are there. I just want to show you very quickly about some of the 2017 data from ICS Yusof Ishak Institute that Marcus and Burhan mentioned before. So immediately in May 2017, we at ICS conducted a survey of 1,600 respondents from around the archipelago in all 34 provinces, and we asked the non-Chinese respondents from the group to ask some of these questions, some prompts about the Chinese Indonesians. So you can see there, I think Marcus before has compared the data to 2018. So tensions were high at that time. Anti-Chinese sentiments were quite high, particularly with this one, Chinese Indonesians as economically privileged. And there are some essentialist assumptions there, such as Chinese Indonesians have a natural talent for success in making money. 68%. They obviously don't know me very well, but so. Chinese Indonesians as economically privileged. Life is easier for Chinese Indonesians. And an interesting fact that we found during this time was the higher the socioeconomic demographic of the respondent, the more likely they think that Chinese Indonesians are wealthy. I guess this has to do with the kind of Chinese Indonesians they meet in everyday life as well. Chinese Indonesians as exclusive, and in particular, I want to point out the data about Chinese Indonesians having their own religion that does not fit well in Indonesia. Sorry, it didn't come out there. But Muslim respondents are more likely to think that Chinese Indonesians have their own religion that does not fit well in Indonesia. So there's this complex overlap between the economy, between economic assumptions, religion, that analysts of Chinese Indonesians have pointed out in the past that complicates the situation about anti-Chinese sentiments in Indonesia, and this is something that we show, that we see as well. This might interest you. We ask our respondents whether they're comfortable to have Chinese Indonesians as a political leader, and we divided the results by ethnicity. So out of all the ethnic groups that we asked, the Balinese are 100% okay with having Chinese Indonesians as a political leader, and also the Bataks are okay with it. They were big supporters of Ahok in Jakarta, according to the data that we have. The rest, and if you notice, with the Bataks and the Balinese, they are a mostly non-Muslim ethnic group. So they themselves also probably see themselves as a minority in some way. So that's an interesting piece of data there. So what does this all mean for Chinese Indonesians? 20 years ago, one of the markers of reform and democratization in conjunction to ethnic minorities was in the treatment of Chinese Indonesians in the Post-Suharto era. And all the Post-Suharto reforms concerning the Chinese were regarded to be one of the markers of democratization and success and acknowledgement towards ethnic minorities in Indonesia. But we see that ethnic Chinese sentiments, maybe that they are latent and never really went away in the post-Suharto years. And certainly upswing in Islamist and pro-pribumi rhetoric since Jakarta election changed public opinions about Chinese Indonesians. So my question is whether politics is back to being off limits for Chinese Indonesians. So a few months ago, I went to West Kalimantan in the lead up to the West Kalimantan gubernatorial election, where it was quite heated between Caroline Margaret Natasa, who's a Dayak Christian, and also Sutarmiji, who was the eventual winner, who was the Islamist candidate. And during that time, I went and saw Chai Chui Mi, who is the mayor of Singkawang City, where it's 71% ethnic Chinese population there, and her being an ethnic Chinese head of town was quite rare. And she said this when I asked about the future of Chinese Indonesians in politics. She said, "It is back to being difficult for us again now. For a while, the ethnic Chinese felt encouraged to enter politics and be more active citizens politically. But I feel that many are scared now after what happened to Ahok in Jakarta. Here in West Kalimantan, look how vicious the attacks towards Caroline is, and she's not even Chinese. Can you imagine if the candidate or even vice governor candidate is a Chinese?" So, I'll promise I finish here. Anti-Chinese and anti-China narratives, looking forward to 2019, we can expect anti-Chinese and anti-China narratives, particularly the anti-China narratives, and the political opposition often attack Jokowi for overdependence on Chinese money and Chinese investments and over closeness to both Chinese tycoons and Chinese investors. How will Chinese Indonesians react? A good barometer to this, according, in my opinion anyway, would be to see whether there is a decline in the number of ethnic Chinese legislative candidates in 2018. If you remember the graph that I showed you earlier before, there's always been a decline with each election cycle. Whether the number will drop or not will be a good indication of us about the mood in the Chinese Indonesian community. And lastly, Jokowi himself has not shown encouraging signs of rebuffing anti-pluralist rhetoric or figures. And in fact, as Tom Power mentioned yesterday, he's been accommodating towards anti-pluralist factions. And this has not increased the confidence among ethnic Chinese. So the question remains, will ethnic Chinese minorities be marginalized through pro-majority campaign rhetoric in 2019? I'll finish that, and I hope we can discuss more later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Charlotte, and I wish that I had heard that speech before I heard Anis Baswedens, and I would have had a lot more context. Our next speaker is Maria Myutel, who is speaking on the history of the Sindhi minority in colonial and post-colonial Indonesia. And this is something that I actually found there was very little written about during my time in Indonesia, so I'm particularly interested in hearing about it. Maria holds master's degrees in philosophy and political science and a PhD in Asian and media studies at the ANU.
Okay, so the aim of my talk today is to present a largely unknown story of the minority-majority relationships in Indonesia. And to do that, I'll use the case of Indians in Indonesia, and more specifically, Sindhis. While the history of Indonesian Chinese is rather well studied, as we know, almost nothing is known about Indonesian Sindhis, another minority of the so-called foreign descent. In general, it's a story of positive and conflict-free experience, where ethnic minority status has been mostly about privilege. At the same time, the Sindhi story serves as a further proof that the ethnic imaginary continues to define the distribution of political, economic, and social power in Indonesia. So in today's talk, I would like to cover the following. First, it's a brief history of Sindhis in Indonesia. Then I'll talk a bit about the Sindhis and the state and the relationship that I characterize as mutual disregard. And the third question would be the question of belonging and what's next. So at the beginning, I want to say just a few words to explain how I ended up studying Sindhis in Indonesia. In fact, I majored in Indian philosophy, philosophical tradition. I studied Sanskrit. I studied political science in Pune University in India. And basically, I knew nothing about Indonesia. It was outside of my research interest, but as it happened, it was not outside of my love interest. So I married, an Indonesian who's not Sindhi, I should say, and we moved to Jakarta. And we rented a house in a residential area where it turned out most of our neighbors were Chinese Indonesians and a few Indian Indonesian families. It didn't take me long to notice that while all residents were mingling with each other and usually kids would play with each other, Indian families were deliberately avoiding any interactions with non-Indians and behaving rather arrogantly, I should say. So such behavior actually puzzled me, and I started looking for answers where they came from, how they live in Indonesia, and why their behavior is so different. And also, I would like to make a point at the very beginning that today my talk is only about Sindhis and not all Indonesians of Indian descent. There are quite many Indian communities in Indonesia, like Tamils, the most numerous one, Sikhs, Gujaratis, Marwaris, Punjabis, and each of these communities have their own story of migration and settlement, and in many ways it is different from the Sindhi one. Who these Sindhis are? Is it? Oh, sorry, did I? Okay. Yeah. So, originally from Sindh, the former territory of British India, and at present a part of the Islamic Republic of Pakistan, Sindhis claim Indian identity, then they maintain a very exclusionist, endogamous way of life. They practice Hinduism that is heavily influenced by Buddhism, Sikhism, and Sufism, and they're one of the wealthiest and well-connected trading communities in the world. At present, there are approximately 10,000 Sindhis in modern-day Indonesia, which means that Sindhis are a tiny minority. Moreover, with only few conversions to Christianity and Islam, Sindhis, as Hindus, are a double minority in Indonesia. The Sindhi community has played a disproportionate role for its size in Indonesian economy and cultural life. So Sindhis are largely credited with the establishment of the development of commercial soap opera production, one of the main industries on the Indonesian media landscapes in the early 90s. And I think you should know the face of the heroes, so that's why I put them there. So Sindhi traders first discovered the Dutch East Indies archipelago in the late 19th century. By the 1930s, the contacts between Sindhi merchants and the trade centers in Surabaya, Semarang, Malang, and Batavia were well established. And colonial administration patronized Sindhis, a wealthy community that supplied the elites with textile luxury goods such as carpets, embroidery, wooden and ivory carvings. As newly arrived, Sindhis were actually similar to the so-called Totok Chinese, or literally full-blooded Chinese. But this resemblance is in fact illusory. The nature of migration and class distinguished Sindhis from Chinese migrants of the late 19th, early 20th century. Although Sindhis spent most of their time in the places of their trade, they were only temporary sojourners with no intention to migrate to Indonesia permanently and to influence or challenge the established political or social order. Moreover, more or less the entire Sindhi community was very well connected to the colonial elite through their business. During the revolutionary period, most Sindhi traders left Indonesia for good, or so they thought. Some, however, stayed and even became involved in the revolutionary struggle by taking the position of mediators between the colonial power and the revolutionary forces. Those Sindhis who returned to Hyderabad in Sindh soon discovered that their home turned into a dangerous place. The partition of British India forced Hindu Sindhis to flee India. While most Sindhis settled in India, a large percentage relocated to places where they previously traded. By the late 1950s, Indonesia accepted approximately 8,000 Sindhi migrants. Most of them settled in Jakarta. Indonesia, which had friendly relationship with India at that time, welcomed post-partition migrants, granting them the status of permanent residents. Moreover, Indonesia increased quotas for remittances for Indian migrants, while, for example, foreign Chinese were banned from sending their remittances during the first years of independence. In 1956, Sukarno, addressing the Convention of Resident Indian Business Associations in Jakarta, encouraged cooperation between the Indian nationals and the Indonesian people. So in other words, Indian migrant businessmen, who mostly Sindhis, were welcomed by the Indonesian state as Indians, as foreign nationals. While calling for cooperation, state officials did not pressure Indian migrants to assimilate. During the last years of Sukarno rule, Sindhis have experienced the most instability in Indonesia. The first anti-Indian demonstration took part in 1962. State managed by Sukarno, young nationalists held marches in the streets of Jakarta and attacked the Indian embassy. In 1965, Sukarno instigated another series of anti-Indian rallies. This time, the protests took place not only in Jakarta, but also in other major cities with the significant Indian population. In both cases, the anti-Indian protests should be understood in the context of the Cold War. In 1962, the dispute between the India and China over the Himalayan border turned into a military conflict, the Sino-Indian War. The staged anti-Indian expressions were organized to show Indonesia's support for China. In 1965, the anti-Indian protests were triggered by the Indo-Pakistani War. Indonesia showed support for Pakistan in response to India's endorsement for the creation of independent Malaya. So the new order regime established by General Sukarno became the period when Sindhi community prospered. This can be attributed to a number of factors: overall improvement of the Indonesian economic climate, the oil boom, and the weakened position of the Chinese Indonesian businesses. For the Sindhi community, which is synonymous with business, the favorable economic conditions were among the main factors that fostered community well-being. In the 70s, most Sindhis, seeing the big potential in the local economy, applied for Indonesian citizenship, which was granted to them with no conditions attached. Those who retained their foreign passports were also able to do business in Indonesia, moving from trade to manufacturing, which was open to private, particularly foreign investment. Again, India-Indonesia relationship played a significant role in enhancing and securing the well-being of Sindhis during the Suharto rule. On a practical level, it's kind of fun fact, Sindhis became the main facilitators of aid that India offered to Indonesia immediately after the regime change. The aid came in the form of the Indian commodities like paper, chemicals, steel, bicycle parts, and Indonesian officials did not know what to do with all these goods. So they asked Indian businessmen who were well known in Jakarta elite circles for their trading skills to help market these goods. So in this way, Sindhi became the key contact for businessmen from India who wished to explore investment opportunities. Moreover, the strategic position of India between two major powers, the US and the USSR, during the Cold War also favored stability of Sindhis in Indonesia. Mistreatment of such a wealthy trading community, which maintained close relationship with India and Southeast Asia, would not have been beneficial for Indonesia in the context of world politics. The downfall of Suharto in 1998 and the outbreak of the state-sponsored violence caused anxiety among Indonesian Sindhis, and I assume they were not the only ones who were worried. So many waited out the turbulent days in the neighboring countries. But those who stayed remembered that it was a little shaky, as they say. They were not sure where they stayed. Would they, rioters took us as pribumi? Not really. As representative Chinese? Again, not really. But at the night passed, Sindhis came to the conclusion that there was no order to target Indians, which again reassured them of their safe position in Indonesia, despite their foreign descent. Overall, people who are interviewed didn't even remember the exact year of these events. With the fall of Suharto's regime, Indonesia entered the phase of democratization with many radical reforms being introduced over the period of time. For Sindhis, the reforms that had had the most impact on the community and its positioning in Indonesia were the changes of the education system. In 2003, the Megawati government annulled the regulation forbidding Indonesian citizens to study in international schools. The abolition of the law stripped Sindhis of the privileges associated with their ethnicity in Indonesia, and also exposed them to a wider community of non-Sindhi Indians and non-Indian Indonesians. So this brings me to the second point of my discussion, the relationship between the community and the state. From the early years of permanent residence, Sindhis, who mostly settled in Jakarta, invested a lot of efforts in preserving their cultural identity. So they did so by forming a number of associations and institutions, and they did establish some new temples. They acquired a whole building, which is Graha Sindhu, for their cultural celebrations, not their religious ones. So they did quite a few, they formed quite an infrastructure around the community. In 1949, they established the Bombay Merchant Association. The association, which membership was strictly limited to the Sindhis, and they made it very explicit. So no other Indonesians of Indian descent were allowed to be members. The founders of the association saw one of the major goals of their association in providing the best possible education for the children of the community. Indeed, the establishment of the school, the Gandhi Memorial School, followed soon in 1950. It was an English medium school with Indian curriculum. So what it meant, so for more than 30 years of its existence, the school had a dubious legal status. It was fully funded by the local trust, but it was registered as an embassy school. The majority of students, children of the local Sindhi families who were either Indonesian citizens or Indonesian residents, were not eligible for enrollment. Since 1960, both citizens and residents were banned from attending schools with foreign language as a medium of instruction and/or foreign curriculum. Despite that, the school remained open, and the Indonesian state officials turned a blind eye to the school's existence. So for more than 30 years of the school's operation, it had a tremendous impact on the community's self-consciousness and the relationships with the Indonesian society. First, and I think this is the most important point, that as the admittance to school was based on ethnicity and not citizenship, Sindhi ethnicity was placed above Indonesian citizenship. Sindhiness, a foreign ethnicity, was then the marker of distinction, not discrimination of marginalization. It ensured access to a high-quality English medium education in Indonesia and not overseas, an opportunity not available to any other Indonesian citizens. The near-native proficiency in English also reinforced the privileged positions of Sindhis in Indonesia. Moreover, while for other Indonesians, Bahasa Indonesia was the language of acquiring knowledge, for Sindhis it was mostly reduced to means of communication with people of lower social rank, like maids, drivers, shop assistants. In general, Sindhis have very limited proficiency in Indonesian language. And last but not least, as a foreign embassy school, Gandhi Memorial School was excluded from the realm of national education, and thus was free from the obligation to create a good Indonesian citizen, the main goal of the education system since the 1960s. Overall, Gandhi Memorial School became the core institution where children born to the Indonesian Sindhi families would become conscious of their distinct identity and the privileges associated with it in Indonesia. The school produced several generations of local and global citizens who felt at ease in Indonesia without losing their connections to India, who belonged without feeling obliged. Miss India Indonesia beauty pageant, a cultural event which has been a part of the community since the mid-1990s, reveals quite well how disassociated the community Sindhis are from the broader Indonesian community. I attended the event in 2013, and even then it failed to demonstrate the perfect blend of two cultures as it was supposed to. So during the talent show and Q&A round, only 1 of 10 contestants was able to somehow show the merge of two cultures. She sang a famous Indonesian song, Sampurna, accompanying herself on a harmonium. So the question and answer session was the most frustrating experience for the contestant and judges alike. To the apparent disappointment of judges, none of the contestants, all of whom were born and brought up in Indonesia, were able to understand and answer the questions in Indonesian language. Overall, since their permanent settlement, Sindhis managed to preserve their ethnocultural identity to such an extent that Sindhis from other parts of the world refer to them as too conservative, too inward-looking, even backward. Indonesian state could partially be blamed for such conservatism. There was no pressure for Sindhis to assimilate or integrate. Unlike Indonesian Chinese, Sindhis didn't have to change their names, carry special identity cards confirming their citizenship. They did not even have to apply for the citizenship. Sindhis were able to attend the embassy school, organize language classes, celebrate cultural and religious festivals as they wished. Of course, the absence of discriminatory state policies targeting Indians didn't mean that Indonesian Sindhis felt no repercussions of policies targeting other minority groups, in particular Chinese Indonesians. In public imagination, heated by the rhetoric of foreigners as common threat to nation building, Indian Indonesians in many ways did not differ much from Indonesians of other foreign descent, like Chinese or Dutch. And they are often referred to as Orang Sana, those people, or just Orang India. Those Sindhis who went into producing local films and later television programs felt these repercussions particularly well, being largely excluded from the history of national cinema and television precisely on the grounds of their foreignness. But for Sindhis, who after partition became increasingly translocal, adaptive, and cosmopolitan, the denial of the place in the national history has not been a major concern. The concept of nation as ultimate locus of belonging remains alien to them. This brings me to the final point, a point about belonging. By and large, this brief history of relationship between the Sindhi community and Indonesian nation state presents a picture of uncontentious, but nonetheless multifaceted belonging. While nation state is illusory, home and homeland are very real to Sindhis. For Indonesian Sindhis, India is homeland, their cultural roots, heritage, and Indonesia is home. India is where Sindhis aspire to be, but in fact never decide to stay. Indonesia is, however, a place to return to after a long travel or years of studying abroad or working abroad, a place that is safe, comfortable, and familiar. The constant presence of real or imaginary India in the everyday life of Sindhis does not make them less connected to Indonesia. What closer connections can one develop with a place than calling it home? As Sindhis often mention to me, they get the best of both worlds. So the question is then, what impact the rise of Indian nationalism and growing xenophobia in Indonesia will have on Indonesian Sindhis in the next decade? So when the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi paid his first ever official visit to Indonesia in May 2018, the wider Indian community, led by Sindhis, expressed huge excitement. The ecstatic reception of the Indian Prime Minister, known for his harsh nationalistic policies and intolerance toward religious minorities, showed that the Indonesian Sindhis and Indians more generally have very strong, affectionate connection to and endorsement of India as a Hindu state. With the growing ethno-nationalism and xenophobia in Indonesia, which resembles modest sectarianism, such expressions of ethnic religious distinction may look alarming. I would, however, presume that given historical experience, the position of the Sindhis and Indian minority more generally will be defined not by the domestic struggles, power struggles, but the relationship between two countries and the presence of the common threat in the Indo-Pacific region. As long as India and Indonesia continue strengthening their relationship to contain the growing power of China, Sindhi and Indian community more generally will retain its rather comfortable position of local foreigners. Thank you.
That was fascinating. Thank you, Maria. The entire 3 years that I was in Indonesia, I spent the whole time wanting to write about the Orang Rimba. And I finally organised a trip, and the day that my plane was about to leave, Mount Agung in Bali started to rumble. And you can imagine where my editors wanted me to be. So I spent the next 10 days fuming in a hotel room, and of course the volcano did never erupt. So anyway, we have absolutely, very happily, Butet Manurung here to talk to us about her 20 years of experience working with the Orang Rimba. Butet earned degrees in anthropology and Indonesian literature, and in 2003 she and 4 fellow educators established Sokola, which brings literacy and advocacy skills to remote communities.
Thank you, Kiro. Hello, I was born and raised in Jakarta, and when I finished high school, I went to Medan, to my ancestor place, convoy with 6 cars. And it took 4 days. On the second night, I was stopped, and apparently in Jambi province, and I wanted to swap driver with my uncle. And I said, before I get out of the car, I said, I need to wee. And when I come back so I jumped to the bush. When I come back, the cars are just all leaving me behind. And I tried to chase and scream, hey, I'm still here. And they just left. So that's the story. And so many trucks passing by, and I was too scared. And I jumped back to the bush again, drank water from the creek, and hid there for a couple hours until my mom realized I was not in the car. So they all come back. So until now, they're always teasing me and said, Butet, you got a curse from the kubu in Jambi. And so here I am. I want to share a story to you about Orang Rimba, the people I work with for these 20 years. So kubu is always known in Trans-Sumatran Highway as Orang Rimba who do not have forest anymore, and they become beggar along Sumatran Highway and stop cars with the lock to ask for money. So who is Orang Rimba? Orang Rimba is the minority, indigenous minority group in Jambi. Yeah? They all 5,700, but I will be focused special on Bukit 12 National Park. They are hunter-gatherer and combine their lifestyle with farming and rubber cultivation. But rubber plantation is interesting because they don't do it themselves. They pay transmigration people to do it for them. So I'd like to tell that Nawacita, yeah, as the 9th National Development Agenda by Jokowi, is actually, the 9th one is actually mentioned about strengthening the unity in diversity, kebinekaan, and they have a special task, a special unit in Kantor Staf Kepresidenan special to help Orang Rimba. But I can say it's very ambigu of the 9 Nawacita because the principle is not aligned with the implementation. I explain later all the project. So marginalisation that Orang Rimba has already started from the name. Kubu is offensive name for the Orang Rimba, just like Dayak instead of Iban or Punan, or Togutil instead of Tobelo, or Baduy instead of Kanekes. So Kubu means primitive, uncivilized, bad smell. So you usually call a very smell dog as Kubu, yeah. And another name, so Orang Rimba is how they call themselves. And another name created by Social Affairs Ministry is Suku Anak Dalam, means people from the deep of the jungle. And this is created back in 1980s when they started the project of housing resettlement for Orang Rimba. Like this is applied to all indigenous people in Jambi, around 200,000. So Orang Rimba is part of Suku Anak Dalam. So history, the first academic who did research is Van Dongen. Yeah, he's notorious research because he removed a few of the Orang Rimba from the jungle and measuring them as if they're a specimen in the laboratory, like measuring the head, the jaw, the brain, and he tried to prove what the local Jambi said, that Orang Rimba is not fully human, like their evolution is not finished yet. So probably very normal back then, so he's officially introduced to the world that there is a group of people named Kubu, and Kubu is like what the local describe. So this is the Orang Rimba with the modernization agenda. If you see to the picture, yeah, luxury for the Orang Rimba is having this animal on their plate. From they were very little. From their very little, they learn how to catch small animal. By the time they're getting older, they try to catch bigger animal like this. And when they're, yeah, this is like a local school. Yeah, this is maybe kindergarten, and then this is maybe elementary. This is maybe a high school. And my first one, this is the professor or the PhD. Yeah, climbing the honey tree. It's the most difficult, and not everyone can do that. It takes courage, and you need to able to sing for the honeybees, so they all leaving the tree, and to persuade the spirit of the tree so you can climb up without being pushed down by the spirit. So modernization agenda is difficult for the Orang Rimba because nomadic lifestyle is their luxury. Yeah, their house is the whole jungle. Oops. To high tech. So by Social Affairs Ministry, the marginalisation is start from the PKMT project back in 1980s. Pemukiman kembali masyarakat terasing or resettlement of the isolated people. It's changing name over the years, but the package of the project is still the same. Starting from making the house, remove them from the forest. The forest is usually converted to something else, so business, transmigration, or into conservation project. And the housing is built very close to each other. They try to copy this housing, yeah, but they make it very close to each other, and it's not rumah panggung, yeah. What is it? It's still house, yeah. And then you can see from the picture here, Ministry of Social Affairs is like baptize one of the Orang Rimba that you are now modern. Put a shirt on him. In 2015, Jokowi visited the Orang Rimba in the south part of Bukit 12. They're landless, and some of them came to Jokowi and requested for the house. And Jokowi responded to that. And Jokowi said, like, he will help all of the Orang Rimba or whatever they need. And this is create controversy because majority of the Orang Rimba still live in the jungle. They are so frightened that Jokowi will turn the whole forest into the city. So this is bring some of my students who is form like organization of youth the Orang Rimba. They came to Kantor Presiden and requested for discussion, and then that's how they create special unit in the Kantor Staff Presiden special for Orang Rimba. Oops. Yeah. This is the conservation project that marginalized the Orang Rimba at the beginning. Yeah. So in 2000, this forest turned into national park, and between 2000 to 2005, there's a lot of meeting that involve NGOs who work with the Orang Rimba, the national park expert, including from Indonesia and also from America, and we were involved in the discussion. But none of Orang Rimba is invited. So we were protesting back then that we said we can't do this, but it makes us never invited anymore for the next meeting. And from 2005 to 2017, all the Orang Rimba youth making every effort so they can stop this national park. The thing of the national park that they're not happy with is this zoning system. This, if you can see, this red one is the core zone that no one can enter this area anymore. This is the hillies area. You can see sacred flowers there that they need for rituals. They found they get their herb medicine from here. But since this is become a zone, they can't enter this anymore. And another zone as well. For research and recreation and many things, but one of the zone is special for Orang Rimba, so they expecting Orang Rimba will be all gathered in just one location. For the Orang Rimba is a big issue because they consist of 12 chiefs, so 12 subgroups, and they all have their own zoning system. So they really objected to this zoning system. So between 2005 to 2017, they make a film, they make a customary land mapping. They report National Park Board to the Human Rights Commission. And so with finally, on 7 September, just last week actually, the agreement was finalized. And this is the agreement. It's agreed that they will recognize the Orang Rimba tradition and will include it into the regulation for the national park. So in this case, it's a happy ending. Yeah. So by religion, just last year, about 200 Orang Rimba converted into Muslim, and this is really draw a huge attention to international media, saying that just so that can receive facilities from the government. They think to get facilities from the government, you need a KTP, yeah? And for KTP, they think they need to put religion, and then they discuss among themselves and they decide which religion should we choose. You know, it's like choosing something in pasar. So they choose, what about Muslim? Because our neighbor here is Muslim. So they converted into Muslim. And officials are so happy with this because once they convert it into one of the major religion, they will give up their nomadic style. And that's more easy to approach them for any other project, yeah, to facilitate on school and everything. There's another case as well in Sijunjung. There's some of the Orang Rimba joint transmigration project, but they refused by the local because they don't want to have neighbor who are infidel. And for Orang Rimba, having KTP is very problematic, yeah, because Orang Rimba is for Orang Rimba woman is forbidden to show their photo to public, and to mention their name is forbidden as well, and same to kids under 5 years old. So when the government makes census, they will just say, for example, Greg as a family, and then they'll say Greg wife, Greg kid number 1, Greg kid number 2. So you can't mention name. So that's how it works. So in education, there's a lot of tension in education. Yeah, all of this time, Ministry of Education think kind of tend to blame the tradition that construct them to join the national school. So it's more like they want Orang Rimba to change so they can absorb the school. It's not the other way around. What we did with Sokola is we came to the jungle and we follow their routine and decide curriculum with them. But with national curriculum, the routine is class with school hours. The subject is not relevant. I remember one day when I teach them by the river, there's a senso orchestra around us because there's a logging, huge logging back then. When the senso is ringing and the tree was falling, they all stare at me and said, Ibu Guru, will this read and write can chase them away? When we able to read and write, can we chase away this logger? So it's really a great concept to me that curriculum should be operational to their daily life problem. And so that's why they don't want to join the local school, yeah, especially because the subject is not relevant. And I wanted to share you the story of Besudut. He's quite phenomenal. He was in the Kick Andy show and several shows on TV. He was my student when he was about 8-9 years old, learning, read and write. And then after he's literate, he went out living the jungle and adopted by one villager. And he converted into Muslim and went to local school. Through the years, he always got supported from teachers, from friends, passing all the exams because he got help. And all the officials really want to have success story of one Orang Rimba who can finish high school, even go to university. And they did it. He's at the university. By the time he's at the university, he doesn't have anyone. He has to, you have to learn independently. And at that show on TV, there's a Ministry of Education giving him scholarship, Telkomsel, Metro TV, everyone want to give him scholarship to prove that Orang Rimba can do it. But then on the second year of university, he ran away from his kos-kosan, come to our kos-kosan, rental room at the university, and then he came back by bus 9 hours to our base camp close to the jungle, and he's saying, I cannot do this anymore. And he's been like an object of, we laughing at him, like all of my students, all the Orang Rimba laughing at him because they agree that what school for, the goal of school is to make someone useful for the community, not just leaving them. Our school is very individualistic. You want to be engineer, you want to be doctor, but for school in the Orang Rimba, they always ask, what can we get, what benefit can we get as a community if my son go to school? Can he chase away, can he stop palm oil, can he chase away a logger? They always ask the community at the community level. So they think Besudut is a huge example of the failure of the education. And it makes a bad example and make even more Orang Rimba doesn't want to go to formal school. And he failed at the university, but the Ministry of Social Affairs asked him to come and become like a honorar, become public servant, like a honorar at the office. But all he can do is making a coffee for guests, photocopy, and he feels like, oh, this is not right. And he ran away again from there, and then become a honorar again in Kantor Camat. And he cannot do this anymore, he said, and then run away again, and he doesn't know what to do. And now I heard that he's like a antek-antek, like he's taken advantage by one of the political party that guaranteed him that he can be the DPRD, like a local parliament member one day. So people laughing at him. So this is an example of, because he's not capable and not ready yet. And here, yeah. And so another example is, there's a kindergarten in outside of the jungle, and they invite all of the Orang Rimba kids to come and put uniform on them because they come with the loincloths, yeah. Put uniform on them. Every day after finish school, they take off again the uniform, and then they put loincloth back again and back to the jungle. Every day like that. So it's funny. And to me it's very funny. So Orang Rimba say, we have uniform, but it's with Ibu Guru, it's not with us. Yeah, so that's the story. And Sokola Institute, our organization, is now involved with the Ministry of Education. We advising them to have to create curriculum for especially for indigenous people, but it is very hard because they still want to have national exam, they still have to want to have a same curriculum for every indigenous people, and it's not so contextual anymore. It's so hard. It's been 2 years, and I think it's backward rather than forward. And with Ministry of Social Affairs also, it's so hard, and often the ministry saying, masih banyak yang telanjang, there's still some that are naked, there is still some that have no religion yet, belum Islam, like that. So it's very difficult, there is lack of understanding. So I want to just to share with you what is normal for the Orang Rimba, what is normal for us, because Ministry of Social Affairs often say, life of Orang Rimba is not normal. And so I want to share with you what Orang Rimba think with our life. Our life is not normal to them. I'll show you one interesting thing is when I took one of the Orang Rimba to my mom's house and they're looking at the toilet and they vomit. They said, what? One hole for everyone for many, many years. Yeah. They can't imagine it. Oh, your fridge is this little. Our fridge is the whole forest. And if you try to calculate their wealth, yeah, a family can have like a billion rupiah, yeah. They have so many trees. Each cubic costs 5 million, because often they said we are so poor. And I said, let's calculate your wealth. And they thought, oh, we are so wealthy. And look at people living in apartment like a bird. Like 5 people in one, like 30 meters square, isn't it pathetic? So they think our life is not normal. So wrap up in the conclusion, I was just highlight that actually what normal for the Orang Rimba is just leave them in peace, of course, but they already marginalized, even living in the jungle, there's a lot of pressure coming from outside world. So if what support they need is not with the modernization, especially if they're not ready and involuntarily. So if modernization applied to them is actually make them even more marginalized. So in this case, it's like the case of them if you do, them if you don't. So it's very hard to be indigenous people, especially for hunter-gatherer, nomad like Orang Rimba. I think that's it for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much. I really wish I had gone now and not got stuck in Bali. We'll take questions 3 at a time. At the back, number 1, number 2, and number 3.
My name is Harun from the University of Canberra. I'm interested in talking about the Orang Rimba. I just have one question. What Indonesian can learn from Australia in dealing with the Aborigines in relation to Orang Rimba? Thank you.
It's not me who answer. Greg.
My name is Kush. I come from Medan, Indonesia. I've got 2 questions. Number 1 is, given the bleak outcome, or the bleak prospect of Indonesian Chinese identity, regardless of the election, should we really care for the election next year? That's number 1 to Professor Setijadi, if I can. Second one is, what can we Indonesians, regardless whether we identify as majority or minority, do to erode or sort of eradicate this misperception that Chinese Indonesians are more privileged, we live an easier life? Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the first part of the question?
The first part is, you mentioned that Jokowi is somewhat, despite all this anti-Ahok sentiment, anti-Chinese sentiment, seemingly quite accommodating to the anti-pluralist view. Why do we care about the election next year then? Because the opponents, we know the campaign leader is Joko Santoso, if I'm not mistaken, who, as you aforementioned, formed the Partai Pribumi. So why do we care about that?
And the third was at the back. So it was just, sorry. There, sorry. Just down here.
My name is Kevin. I would like to ask a few questions regarding and a few comments on Chinese Indonesian to Charlotte as well. It was a very great presentation, and I think I've spoken to some people before. I love this quote by Yusuf Wanandi, the founder of Jakarta Post and CSIS. He was speaking about Suharto's relationship with Chinese Indonesians, in particular Chukongs, or the bosses in general. Chinese Indonesians were treated like second wives. We were enjoyed, but we were not recognized. So that quote, I think, and I think the sentiment we have with Ahok is that in 2014, young Chinese Indonesians, particularly in Bandung and particularly around, we see Ahok as a sign that maybe we're no longer second wives anymore, so maybe we are starting to get recognized. And I think the pain was in 2017 was we look at somebody who is basically almost impeccable in terms of attitude, in terms of clean. He was clean, he was competent, and yet he was still treated really, really badly for just one slip of a tongue, basically. So it was, and then of course in 2018 you have Jokowi appointing Maruf Amin, which is seen again as, I think, in my opinion, is some sort of a betrayal, again. And even though it's politically astute, I still have some select words regarding that, but still. So how do you think that Indonesians' relationships still, are we still the second wives in particular? So, yeah, because I think it's really difficult for a young Chinese Indonesian to be after Ahok days. There's just, you know, we thought we were there, we were not there. Yeah. So. Like.
Thank you. We might go through to Butet first.
I don't think I have capacity to answer that. Maybe one of the professor here. I just think Aboriginal people here is too spoiled by the government. This is very personal opinion. Yeah, and I think it's not good. Yeah, for indigenous people in Indonesia, being ignored is actually better than being campur tangan.
Interfered with?
Yeah, interfered by the government with all the misconducted project. So actually for Orang Rimba now it's more complicated because too many intervention with too many misunderstanding, and being spoiled is not good. I don't know.
Charlotte, I think the next two were for you.
Okay. I will thank you very much for your questions. The first one, why should we care about the election? I think precisely for the reasons that you were talking about before, actually. Tom yesterday spoke about how Jokowi, instead of, I guess, standing up for pluralism and during the whole entire Ahok saga last year, he didn't say a word, and he distanced himself away from Ahok, which from a political point of view made sense for Jokowi. And his popularity rating was not affected by Ahok, at least not by much according to the surveys. But it was a bad signal for a lot of Chinese Indonesians. A lot of Chinese Indonesians felt that at least in Jokowi they have a pro-pluralist figure who is going to be, if not, at least is going to leave them alone, if not be negative towards them. But yeah, no, the accommodation of anti-pluralist figures such as Maruf Amin disappointed a lot of people. But I think this is even more why we should care about the rhetoric towards not just the Chinese Indonesians. Sometimes when we talk about Chinese Indonesians, it's often separated from the discussion about minorities generally. But as we've seen from this conference, attitudes towards minorities generally have been not showing a very good sign, and I think that's why, as analysts, we should pay more attention to it. To Kevin, is our Chinese Indonesians still second wives? That's an interesting way to put it. Enjoyed but not recognized. I probably should put that in one of my papers. But are we still like that now? I don't know the answer to that, but I think what the events of the last year and indeed, like, you know, in the last few years with how the trends to do with Chinese Indonesians as a whole, to me says that, you know, the mentality of, you know, who can be regarded as pribumi and non-pribumi, foreigners and non-foreigners, particularly in regards to Chinese Indonesians, have not changed. I think Maria's explanation of the Sindhi community as also an exclusive community, yet distinguished very differently in the eyes of the Indonesian public, is very telling about the complexities and political history of Chinese Indonesians. So I don't think much has changed in that regard, and I hope the young people won't be discouraged by it too much.
Who else would like to ask questions? 1, 2, 3.
I have a question on the Chinese. Di sini.
Oh, hi.
When you have that data on Chinese legislator, Chinese candidate,
Yeah.
How do you define ethnic Chinese there? And is it self-proclaimed, or how do you do that?
Mm-hmm.
Can I just want for Orang Rimba? Is it a self-contained category? Is Orang Rimba also, does Orang Rimba as a category a monolithic category, or there are many different parts of Orang Rimba competing with one another? Thanks.
Thank you. Charles Koppel. Question for Charlotte, or partly comment, I think. The issue of pre-Bumi and the victory speeches or the inauguration speech, the double standards involved in this, as you pointed out, pre-Bumi tends not to be used to people of Arab descent, like Anies Baswedan. But during the course of the campaign for governor, he put in a pitch for the special case of Arabs as supporters of the Indonesian nation. His grandfather, I think he was a founder, or the founder of the Partai Arab Indonesia, and he claimed some special place for the Arabs in supporting Indonesian nationalism under colonial rule. We at last are masters in our own house as well as part of all of this kind of rhetoric. And yet the Partai Tionghoa Indonesia, the corresponding Chinese party, was already in existence for a couple of years before the Partai Arab Indonesia. And in fact, the two leaders of those parties were comrades in arms in support of Indonesian nationalism. So there's a great deal of hypocrisy and double standards implied in all of this.
Thanks, Charles. Yeah, you're absolutely right.
Hi, Tom Power from ANU. A question for Charlotte. Just picking up on the data that you had from 2004 to 2014, I'm wondering whether you've got any sense of the data in 2019 for the candidates for next year's election. Is there a drop in the number of Chinese candidates, or is it stable? Is it actually continuing to go up? I think that's a really interesting point for your paper in sort of post-Ahok landscape. Thanks.
Well, I think we might start, Butet, with you again.
So Orang Rimba is actually, they said they're the one who ran away from the government and the Dutch colony back then. So coming from South Sumatra, from Jambi, and from West Sumatra, from the Kesultanan, because they don't want to pay upeti. What is upeti? To the government. Like a tax maybe, yeah. A tribute to the Kesultanan. So they don't want to change. They also against the big religion, like a mainstream religion. So they stay in the jungle. But they all have their own autonomy. They live in 3 concentrated areas, but in the past, before Trans-Sumatran Highway, before there are provinces, they're all in one forest. But because of all this development, they are now concentrated in 3 different areas. But there are only about 12 ketemenggungan, like chiefs. They all have their own autonomy and territory. So even though their land is already become national park, or become palm oil, or even house of someone in transmigration area, they still think that their ancestors still there. So they will just become like a dweller there, waiting, like worship there, and then taking all of the fruit, whatever fruit coming from the tree. They think the land is belong to someone else, but whatever grow, it belongs to them. So often there's a cases where they get shot by people kesenapan rakitan ya, like rifle, and sometimes chased away by tentara ya, like by the soldier, because they think they are like a pest in someone else's house, like that. So many of Orang Rimba already, the one that become beggar, about 1,700 maybe along Sumatran Highway. They are not having land, and they are not having. They just become like a hunter, special for. It's like a task force for hunting for pig in palm oil. So often, palm oil owner rent a group of Orang Rimba with their dogs in the truck, going to palm oil with the pest full of pig, going down there and clean the whole pig at this palm oil plantation. So that's the mutual benefit that they sometimes did with the Orang Rimba along the Sumatran Highway. That's a big failure example for the Orang Rimba in the jungle. They're so scared that they one day end up like that. Even though they have housing from the Department of Social Affairs, they always live in the house again. So, yeah.
Thank you, Sandra, for your question before. That's a good question, actually. I was actually just talking to Marcus Mietzner about this. How do you know which ones are Chinese Indonesians? Because most Indonesians would be able to tell Chinese Indonesian names, but some of them, even I can't tell. But the numbers that I displayed to you before in the graph were actually compiled. I got that data as well from the Indonesian Chinese Association. So they try to keep track of Chinese Indonesian politicians, and they compiled the data that they kindly shared to me. But I always kind of feel bad about this, because a lot of the Chinese Indonesian politicians that I spoke to as well resent being characterized as ethnic Chinese. I was like, this is, people like the Chinese Indonesian organizations, and I have to admit people like me as well label them as Chinese Indonesians for data purposes. But they say, well, I'm here to fight for my local kabupaten or local kecamatan, and but yeah, so there's I feel bad about that as well. But in terms of the data, that was compiled by the Chinese Indonesian Association. Thank you, Charles, and for pointing out that Anis's grandfather was one of the founders of Partai Arab Indonesia. I actually didn't know that, which. Made what he said about the pribumi distinction even more hypocritical in many ways. And what so Robert Cribb yesterday mentioned this when you spoke about the Arab community as well, and it's actually really interesting about them not being characterized as non-pribumi in that sense. I guess because of the same religion of Islam, and also the social trust that Robert mentioned too. And in many ways, I think they are considered to be better Muslims because they're closer to the origins of Islam in the Middle East. So there's a lot of complexity there. With Tom, thanks Tom for your comment. Yeah, as far as I know, there's not data out yet with the numbers of potential Chinese candidates for 2019. It should come out any day now, and I should be able to start compiling that soon, perhaps like with the Chinese Association's help as well. What will be interesting for me as well are party supports for Chinese Indonesian candidates, because like in the past, parties like Chinese Indonesians have been supported mainly by PDIP, by NASDEM, and by PKB. So it'll be interesting their support there too. With PKB, politicians like Daniel Johan in West Kalimantan was inspired by Gus Dur and said, well, this was the party of Gus Dur, and Gus Dur was pluralist, so I want to be the Chinese face in this Islamic party. It'll be interesting to see whether that has changed, because a lot of these parties also supported Chinese candidates in the past to show that they're pluralist and to show that they're open and wanting to get Chinese votes. So whether the numbers go down or not will be good to compare.
We probably have a time for one last question. Yep. Oh, that's just down here. Sorry, down here.
Yeah, I'd just like to ask Marlina, is there a difference between the Orang Rimba and the Orang Talamamak in the Bukit Tigapulu? Because I know the Talamamak, who I saw some years ago, they were planting cassava and engaging in hunting, of course, and collecting forest products. But could you just tell me what the differences are between the Orang Rimba and the Orang Talamamak?
Straight away, okay. Oh, I thought waiting for another question. So Talang Mamak is in the border of Riau, so already part of Riau, and their language is the same. I was there as well for a few months, and they said like Orang Rimba will say something like kemono to say where, and Orang Talang Mamak will say kemona, and so many different things, just a different dialect. So. But the culture is quite different, especially the matrilocal. So Orang Rimba is very matrilocal. So husband leaving their family and stay with the wife's family, and they have also Talang Mamak is not nomadic. Orang Rimba is nomadic, and Orang Rimba has melangun. That's their special characteristic that other indigenous people don't have. Melangun is leaving the house or leaving the place where they are when someone is died, and they will crying along the way while they're leaving the place to avoid bad curse, and then come back again after a few years. So this is also like a rehabilitation for the place they left. So when it turns into forest again, they come back again. And also adat like semendo, tradition of semendo. Semendo is like a bride service during the during engagement, during pacaran. So Orang Rimba doesn't know dating, yeah. So straight away, engage, yeah. So sometimes they can start since they were so little, 10 years old. So living very close to the girl's family, and then feeding the whole family of the girl. And then after the woman's father think that he is ready enough to be father or a husband, then he is accepted. But sometimes along the way, the girl change their mind, they want another boy, and so he is being like dibuang, yeah, being dumped. So often, yeah, often men in Orang Rimba often like broken-hearted men are more many than broken-hearted women. Yeah. And man is always, yeah, there's a very well-known pepatah, like saying about this. Durian is woman and cucumber is a man. So if the durian falling into cucumber, of course the durian is smashed, yeah. But if the cucumber just leaning to the durian, still the cucumber is smashed. So this means woman is always win. So when they're dating, like I still remember I have one of my students, they got they got fined from the family of the woman because this girl falling in love with him and couldn't eat, couldn't sleep, and still the boy get fined. The boy doesn't do anything, but they said, you make my daughter cannot sleep, cannot eat. It's your fault. So he got fined. So this particular tradition is Talang Mamak doesn't have. So very, very into woman, very highly respecting woman.
I know everyone's looking forward to Sidney speaking, so I might wrap it up there. Can you please all thank our fantastic panellists?
Okay. For our final session, it's my great pleasure to welcome Sidney Jones. If the Indonesia Project ever strikes a medal for not only the most frequent appearances as a speaker at update conferences, but also perhaps the greatest contribution, I suspect that Sidney will be in the running to get one of these very valuable medals because she's been a frequent visitor and I think a much loved visitor to these conferences. And she's best known to the Australian public as a commentator on terrorism. But those of us who attend these conferences and who read the reports that she's put out through IPAC and the International Crisis Group knows that she's got extraordinary breadth and depth of knowledge about Indonesia, about a wide range of social, cultural, religious, sometimes political issues in Indonesia. And this is the reason why we're always so grateful to have Sidney here. And in this particular context, when Ronit and I were discussing who would be best to, because one of the problems with a topic like minorities is trying to pull some of the themes together. And we thought one of the best people, or the best person to do this would be Sidney. So we asked her to give reflections on the conference as a whole, and indeed the broader issue of minorities, and we were delighted when she agreed to that. So Sidney, with great pleasure, we welcome you again to the microphone.
Thank you, Greg and Ronit. This is the shrinking violet role at the end of the conference. This has been a fantastic series of papers, and I think what they do is illuminate not just minorities and majorities, but as we heard from Tom and as we heard from Robert earlier, it also is a way of looking at where Indonesian democracy is and is going. It's also a question of looking at justice. I think one of the themes that comes out, whether we're looking at the LGBT community or we're looking at Orang Rimba or we're looking at the ethnic Chinese or we're looking at religious minorities, is where you get justice in a situation where we seem to be moving toward a majoritarian state. And I'll get back a little bit later to the idea of what's majoritarian about the current developments. But I also want to stress that the idea of minorities and majorities is something that's infinitely malleable in a way. And there isn't anything static about the notion of a minority. And one of the interesting things is how the concepts of minority and majority can be manipulated deliberately for political or economic gain, but also how one can transfer into the other depending on where you are and what level of government you're looking at. So I think I'll start by reiterating some of the themes that were brought out by Robert. I hadn't actually seen Robert's paper before he gave it, but there were some overlapping issues. So this is a conference about contentiousness, and it's about what makes a minority status or a majority status contentious. And I would argue that in some parts of Indonesia, it's actually not the Muslim versus non-Muslim, but it's the indigenous versus migrant. This is one of the themes that Robert raised, but if you look at parts of Lampung, Jambi, Riau, parts of Kalimantan, certainly parts of Indonesia, it's the indigenous migrant issue that's the dominant cleavage and the area where we have most contentiousness. I think one of the things that's interesting about the indigenous versus migrant is that it brings out how easily minority status can change. Because you can have a Javanese that nationally is the dominant ethnic group, majority ethnic group. That Javanese moves to a community in Kalimantan and becomes a minority, but then over time, as generations pass, it can become a majority again in a village or a kecamatan or so on. The same thing happens or can happen with the phenomenon of local adat communities. We just heard about the Orang Rimba, but we have several areas now in Indonesia where the movement for adat rights has gotten to the point where some unscrupulous individuals, often backed by local DPRD figures or local politicians, see the possibility of being able to reclaim land as adat through the courts and therefore set up fake adat organizations in order to make those claims. So we have a couple of contesting rights issues that emerge. One is how you protect local adat communities or groups like the Orang Rimba, but another is what you do when claims are made against some of the migrants who, after all, are full Indonesian citizens as well, and who sometimes, through the transmigration program, acquired land through fully legal procedures at the time, but whose ownership is now threatened by some of these claims of adat groups. Who's got the right? Whose right trumps whose? And where does justice lie, especially when you've got a completely dysfunctional court system, as Tim and Simon showed us yesterday? Also, when we're dealing with communities threatened by incoming migrants, what do you do about the right to freedom of movement if mobility is a fundamental tenet of liberal democracy? One great example is the Bhutanese in West Seram. And there's been a lot of great work done by Birgit Brauchler at Monash. But this is a case where we've had Bhutanese migration into West Seram for generations, to the point where there are now at least 3 kechamatans where the Bhutanese are a very strong majority, and 1 village where the Bhutanese represent 90% of the population, but have no right to own land because of the Raja's control over land rights through the Adat communities in West Seram, and also have no right to representation on village councils. Now, whose rights should take prominence there? Do the Rajas, who are, after all, the old aristocracy, do they have the right to control land in perpetuity? Or are there rights that should accrue to the migrant community simply by virtue of the fact that they now have majority status? And I think Indonesia is dealing with some of these issues across the country. Now, in Papua, this issue is even more fraught because it's become a critical part of the political narrative of the pro-independence movement that Papua is being swamped by migrants from outside. And of course, this extends way beyond the pro-independence movement to many Papuans who are not necessarily supportive of the independence movement, but believe their way of life and their identity is being swamped by all these migrants coming in. So in this slide, you see 4 areas where Javanese have become the largest ethnic group, even though Papuan groups combined still outnumber the Javanese, except in Sorong, where the Javanese are now the majority. But it's Kerom, it's the Merauke region, it's Nabire and Sorong, where the Javanese are now the largest single ethnic group. And I think after the 2020 census, we may find that Papuans in some of these areas are no longer combined the majority. But again, whose rights are at stake here? And what kind of measures can be put in place to guarantee the rights of Orang Asli Papua, indigenous Papuans, without somehow compromising the notion of justice in a democratic society? The other interesting thing is who constitutes Orang Asli. It gets to Sandra's question about the Chinese, because in Papua province, the idea of indigenousness is traced through the father. If your father is Melanesian Papuan, then you're a Papuan. But in West Papua, it's traced through the mother because so many Papuan women married Buginese and other migrant groups coming through. So you have two provinces and two very different concepts of who constitutes Orang Asli. The problem that many parts of Indonesia are facing is this notion that there is some gain likely to accrue to being a member of an Adat group. And as I say, we're getting the creation of fake Adat groups in some areas, but we're also seeing competition among Adat groups for the same land. And there is no good mechanism in Indonesia to date to resolve these kinds of land disputes. We're also seeing the co-optation of Adat leaders by corporations and by political leaders to move in and basically buy off Adat claims. We're seeing the disenfranchisement of migrant communities, and especially trans-migrants, who are now a vulnerable community despite the bad reputation that the transmigration program has in some areas. And we're also seeing the notion of Adat being used to restore old aristocracies in some areas. So all these issues raise problems of where justice lies. Likewise, Robert touched on the issue of Putra Daerah and Pemekaran, or administrative fragmentation. This is another way in which majorities or minorities can get switched around, because the whole idea of Pemekaran as it works in eastern Indonesia is basically to carve out a new district or a new sub-district so that a particular ethnic group can go from being a minority to being a majority. This is why West Sulawesi got created, because the ethnic Mandar never got jobs in the South Sulawesi government. And they felt disadvantaged and deprived and disenfranchised. So they mounted a campaign for West Sulawesi so that the Mandars became the majority in that community. Likewise in Papua, Lani Jaya gets carved out of Jayawijaya in 2008 so that the ethnic Lani can become the majority. So we have this process, which is an administrative process, which helps transform minorities into majorities for clear political and economic gain. So again, it's a concept that makes the minority status completely changeable over time. Now, someone asked yesterday about, Ed asked about racial discrimination against Papuans. I think what we need is actually a survey of the kind that Marcus and Burhan did about Chinese, or Charlotte's data on the Chinese, and look at it in terms of blackness in Indonesia. Because I don't think you have to look very far to get a sense of prejudice against blacks, whether you're West African, an African American visitor going through immigration, or Melanesian. But the Melanesian case is particularly interesting because Papuans have defined themselves as Melanesian as opposed to Malay. And it became a very important marker of Papuan identity, seeing themselves as part of Melanesia and the Melanesian Pacific rather than Malay and the rest of Indonesia. But this became a manipulable issue when the Papuans wanted observer status, or wanted full membership actually, in the Melanesian Spearhead Group. So what you had, the Melanesian Spearhead Group is a group of 5 Pacific countries, actually 4 countries plus the New Caledonian Kanak Liberation Movement. And Indonesia saw the Papuans trying to get membership as a pro-independence movement through what's called ULMWP, the United Liberation Movement for West Papua. And they said, we deserve membership more than this liberation movement because Indonesia is the largest Melanesian country in the world, and our Melanesian population is larger than all the members of the Melanesian Spearhead Group combined. So it's the first time that the Indonesian government, this was in 2015, had consciously taken the identity of Papuans as Melanesians and taken it on board in order to thwart Papuans succeeding in getting membership status in the Melanesian Spearhead Group. What they said, what the Indonesian government said, was that it's not just Papua and West Papua that should be seen as Melanesian, it's also Maluku, North Maluku, and NTT, who are all Melanesian, and therefore we deserve membership. We see in this picture here the former Minister of Education, who was a completely useless Minister of Education, talking about how Indonesia has the largest population of Melanesians, and then this being rejected by the Papuan independence movement, saying Maluku and NTT, they're not Melanesian, and more importantly, they never self-identified as Melanesian. In Maluku, the Ambon governor was very proud of the fact that Moluccans were part Arab, part Chinese, part you name it, but not Melanesian. So all of this gets to the idea of what the threat now is. Why are some of these issues of belonging contentious? And most of the answers that have come out of this session thus far actually come back to this notion of Muslim majoritarianism. So I think it's important to try and define what that actually is. So majoritarianism, whether you're talking about Make America Great Again or you're talking about Modi's BJP, is an idea that members of the majority faith and culture are viewed as the nation's true citizens, and anybody else is basically a guest, or at least someone of lesser status than the dominant majority. And those who don't have the good fortune to be part of the majority are expected to behave deferentially. And what this has done is create pressure to abide by norms and values as defined not by the objective majority of the population, but by the Islamist activists who control the political agenda. Now, a great example of this was collected by my colleague, Nava Nurania, when she interviewed the president of the alumni 212 movement. And he said, what do we mean by, he said, how can Islam be honored, respected, given its proportional place in Indonesia? What do we mean by proportional? If Muslims here constitute 90% of the population, then that means their proportion of jobs in the government should also be 90%. That's classic majoritarianism. But the next quote is even better. This is Nava's quote with Lutfi Fatullah. We don't have a problem with the NKRI, but we say our NKRI is better than your NKRI. And that, again, classic majoritarianism. So one of the things we're seeing from that kind of position is a message that Marcus and Burhan found in their data being reiterated in different areas, that a non-Muslim cannot hold public office. We saw this just recently in the local elections in West Kalimantan and in North Sumatra. But this massive morning prayer pictured in the slide looks a lot like the 212 demo in Jakarta. But this was on Eid al-Fitri in Pontianak, and the sermon in Pontianak was basically the script from the anti-Ahok movement. The preacher said that voting was obligatory for all Muslims if by failing to vote, leadership could fall to a non-Muslim. This is when we had one Muslim candidate running against two Christian Dayak candidates. Islam absolutely forbids non-Muslim leaders, and Muslims who choose non-Muslim leaders should be seen as having left Islam. And that was that's the kind of warning that was circulated around mosques in Jakarta during the anti-Ahok protests, but that's also a theme that resonated with voters in West Kalimantan, and 80% of the Muslims voted for the Muslim candidate. There's also a sense in a majoritarian state that the majority has a right to reject policies or laws or regulations that run counter to its beliefs and interests. And one of the things we're seeing now is a rejection of vaccines, for example, by Muslim groups in local areas, even though the national MUE, working with the Ministry of Health, has said in a kind of backhanded way, even though the vaccines are haram, the emergency is so dire that it's permissible to have your children inoculated. But in local areas, many local MUE are giving the exact opposite message, that haram is haram and you should stay away from vaccines. Likewise, on the loudspeaker issue, the Bupati of Luwu and others in different parts of the country has said, ignore the Ministry of Religion's edict on loudspeakers, basically use them as loud as you like and as long as you like and whenever you like. And I'm not going to do anything about it. Another aspect that's critical to the idea of majoritarianism is that somehow the majority is besieged or under threat. And I think that theme has come out of a lot of these papers. It's the conspiracy theories about the West wanting to destroy Islam and Indonesia. It's Gatot Nurmianto's idea of proxy war, that the country is encircled by enemies who are usually NGOs, academics, and multinational corporations, who are trying to steal Indonesia's resources, weaken its economy, and corrupt its youth. And that message resonates very strongly with some of the Islamist groups in Indonesia, making possible an alliance of hardline secular nationalists with hardline Islamists in a way that's damaging to minorities. There's also the fear of Christianization, of the fact that that people are standing on street corners trying to convert Muslims and buy off Muslims. And this comes out most particularly in times of natural disasters where aid comes in to a particular place, most recently in the Lombok earthquake. And unfortunately, sometimes it's true that Protestant evangelical groups come in with aid thinking that this will be an opportunity for preaching in a way that isn't at local times. Also, this idea of a wave of immorality and of an epidemic of LGBT, it's a wabah, that also is part of this notion of threat, of the majority under threat from outside forces. So the basic principle that we have to return to is that democracy is about political equality, and it's about justice for all, regardless of race, religion, ethnicity, or secular orientation. And it's not a question that the majority can simply dictate the rules. But I would also say, I remember a conference that we had with Ihsan Ali Fauzi, and we were talking about the threats against non-Muslim minorities in Indonesia, and one Christian activist raised her hand and she said, "But we don't want to be thought of as minorities. We're citizens." And with that, I'll close. Thank you.
Thank you, Sidney, for that tour de force splendid set of reflections on minority issues, majority issues in Indonesia and the conference as a whole. And long may you continue to come and return to the update and grace the podium here. So thank you very much. I have just a few concluding remarks to make, and then I'll hand over to Blaine Lewis, the head of the Indonesia project, and we'll soon be able to go to lunch. I just wanted to express the delight that Ronit and I have felt at how the conference has gone over the last 2 days. And we want to primarily pay tribute to all of the speakers. The standard of the papers has been consistently very high, the quality of the analysis also extremely impressive. We've been very taken by the way in which speakers have put so much effort into the paper and the way in which they've responded to comments from us and sometimes other people on their panels. And we also wanted to pay tribute to members of the audience, because it seems to me that the questions and the comments that have been made during sessions have also been extremely constructive, extremely helpful, and have contributed to a really stimulating environment throughout the conference. So thank you to everyone here and to those who were here yesterday but not today. I'd also want to make note of the fact that Ronit and I have been listening very carefully to some of the problematising of the definitions of minorities. And one of the things, in fact, that happened as soon as the theme of the conference was announced is that we were importuned by emails and requests from people saying, we represent a minority, or we're doing research on this minority or that minority, and we should be represented at the Update conference as well. And the longer the conference goes on, the more it's particularly I become aware of the sheer complexity of these issues and how potentially we could have a 4 or 5 day conference and not at all exhaust the possibilities for exploring this topic. So in a way, apologies to those people who feel as if they should also have had a space in the conference, but we're limited to a day and a half and we'll just have to do the best with the time available to us. But we take the points that you've been making. And indeed, there's a great deal for Ronit and I to contemplate as we frame the book that will be following in the next few months. We're very confident, based on the quality of the presentations, that this will be an excellent book, a book of great substance on the issue of minorities in Indonesia. And that captures not only, I think, the scholarly contributions that presenters have made, but also the passion that all the presenters feel for this topic. It's not just a dry academic topic. Many of us know people in minority groups who in various ways experience hardship or have had to struggle for whatever rights that they may currently enjoy. So this is a very important book and we want it to have impact. So over the next few months, we're going to be liaising very closely with all the contributors, and we would just urge you to look out for the book, which will be published in the middle of next year. So it comes out very quickly. So that ends my comments about the conference itself. What I also need to do is to thank quite a few people who played a really important role in making the conference happen. And one of the delights of organising this conference is that there's a team of people who are extraordinarily competent and experienced at making this run. like clockwork, year in, year out. And I'm not sure how many of them are here, but is Kate McClinton here? Or Nuka? They're probably outside doing what they do all the time, making things run. But there's 4 people in particular I want to mention. Kate McClinton, Lydia, who I think is here in the front looking at the social media feed, Nuka and Ruth. And these 4 people have been really the core team. And particular note for Kate McClinton, who is many months pregnant, and despite all of that has shown extraordinary energy and judgment in running things right up until today. And we wish her all the best for the birth of her baby very soon. I'd also like to add to that Maxine and Twee, 2 members of my department who also assist with some of the aspects of organisation of the conference. We've also drawn a great deal of help from PPIR, ANU, so the Indonesian Students Association at ANU, and from the ANU ASEAN Society. I'd like to mention the IT staff, Rusan Joseph, and Vishnu, for the work that they've done. There've been no IT glitches at all. And lastly, but not least, our volunteers, and a few names to mention, but we really appreciate their work. Pippa, Agung, Jerry, Ira, Kevin, Mira, Natalia, Praise, Fakurazi, Riza, Razi, Risky, Olid, Viraji, Zuhti, and last of all, Stephanie. So thank you as well. And just the last thing on behalf of RENIT, we would like to thank very much the Indonesia Project and DFAT. We've really made this possible, and it's my great pleasure to hand over to Blaine Lewis for concluding remarks. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. So on behalf of the Indonesia Project, I have 2 tasks I'd like to finish up with, and then, in fact, we will have lunch, actually. I'd like to start by thanking Ranit and Greg for putting together a terrific conference, and we'll look forward to the book. I'd also like to thank, on behalf of the project, the speakers, the discussants, again, the support staff from the Indonesia Project, and our student volunteers. I'd also like to pay special thanks, which I think we haven't done yet, to those who have taken on the thankful task of moderating these sessions, or the umpires, as they were called earlier today, especially in the face of possibly undemocratic and certainly intolerant, shall we say, potential outbursts from angry Mina women, who shall go unnamed. I'm just kidding, Bu. Yeah, makasih ya. And my final task is to let you know that even though this is the end of this year's update, we have already started to plan for next year's update. You may be surprised to learn. And in that context, I'd like to invite our two co-conveners who are making their way down here even as I speak. That's Tom Powers, whose presentation, thought-provoking presentation you will have seen yesterday, PhD candidate in Coral Bell. And then Eve Warburton, who has recently taken her PhD, a rising star in the field and currently working in Singapore. And they'll give you a brief rundown on what to expect for next year. So Tom and Eve, thank you.
Thanks, Blaine, and good afternoon, everyone. So I'm sure everyone knows that next year is an election year in Indonesia. So Indonesia will be holding its 4th direct presidential elections. And for the first time, those elections will be held simultaneously with legislative elections. It's also just over 2 decades since Indonesia began its transition to democracy. And so we think it's very fitting that next year we have a politically themed update. So the topic for next year will be From Stagnation to Regression, Indonesian Democracy After 20 Years. And in case you couldn't hear the upward inflection in my voice, that's a question mark, not a statement. But obviously I think, after Tom's outstanding political update yesterday, and given all of the themes and propositions that have been put forward over the last few days, I'm sure that topic comes as no surprise to anyone in the room. So just a few words about what we want to do next year. So like many other democracies around the world, Indonesia is increasingly showing signs of democratic fragility. There's been a rise in authoritarian populism, the arbitrary state crackdown on freedom of speech, freedom of organisation. As we've seen a lot over the past few days, a serious deterioration in the protection of minority rights. And then there are all the deep-seated problems that many people in the room have been writing about for many years: corruption, clientelism, and unequal access to legal protection and redress, the underrepresentation of lower class and minority groups in the political system, and of course, growing support for religious majoritarianism. Many of the symptoms of democratic fragility, we will know, were diagnosed during the Yudhoyono era. But to the surprise of many of us, the most dramatic decline in democratic quality has occurred on President Jokowi's watch, and we really want to know why. So that will be one of the big focuses of our update next year.
Sure. Just to continue, so we accept, of course, Indonesia's well-earned reputation as one of these sort of outstanding success stories of the third wave of democracy. But at the same time, we think that the warning signs of democratic deterioration are now too urgent to ignore. We also suggest that when we look at the region and we look around the world, cases like the Philippines, like Turkey, suggest that there is this global pattern of democratic deconsolidation, and we want to frame Indonesia's case within that broader pattern. So the contributors to next year's update will be identifying, assessing, and debating the signs of deconsolidation across a range of political and institutional contexts. And they will do so with a view not to just assessing Indonesia's democratic evolution over time, but also to situating the case of Indonesia within that context of a global democratic recession. I think I speak for us both when we say that we really hope that the turnout approaches what it was this year. And we can only hope that, that it is as an enjoyable conference as we've had this year. Thank you very much, of course, to the Indonesia Project, to DFAT, and please look out for updates further along the line. Thank you very much.